This is Theology Bits with Pastor Ben, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. This week, we continue our series on continuity and change in the Old Testament, focusing on the character of Abraham, beginning in Genesis chapter 12. Reminder that in this series, what we're looking for is not just the content of what happened during those scenes, but what was different about these scenes from what came before. So a reminder that we just did a discussion of the primeval history, Genesis 1 to 11, and then we have something new, which is the covenant God has with Abraham. Now, covenant is something that we did meet already earlier on in the primeval history, but here in Genesis chapter 12, we meet it again. And many of you are familiar with the covenant God has with Abraham, but there's actually not one, but 5 covenants that God makes with Abraham that we're going to be emphasizing. In Genesis 12, the covenant that is presented there is going to be different from the one that God makes with Noah. The one God makes with Noah is after the flood, after a great event, that it honestly is apropos that God is saying something. And here, though, in Genesis 12, this covenant God makes with Abram is apropos of nothing. There is no good reason for this to happen as far as we know from the life of Abram. Instead, Abram is simply told to go to a new land and that God is going to make Abram into a great nation, that God is going to bless Abram, and that his name shall be great. Now, many of you are familiar with the covenant of Abraham and say there might be something that feels missing here. But it's also notable how different this is. First of all, there seems to be this emphasis on you being a nation, and there's more than that, suggesting that you'll be blessed, and you're going to be blessed in a different way than other people. That is completely new. That you, Abram, are going to have a different kind of relationship with God than everyone else. Very different in the primeval history. And that part of being a blessing is that you will be a blessing to others, so that others are included, but in a secondary route rather than a primary route. The second thing, we see the second covenant shows up in Genesis chapter 13. After the split between Abram and Lot, then we have a new development where once they split, Abram goes to the land of Canaan. And this is the first time with this new covenant that he will have many descendants. This is like the dust of the earth, so shall your descendants be. That was not in Genesis chapter 12, but here in Genesis chapter 13, and that Abram must walk the land itself, and that this land, this particular land, this land of Canaan, is going to be a special land to Abram. Again, very different from we have, that there's an idea that there's a special land that is particularly set aside for one person rather than other people. Not something we saw before. Then we have Genesis chapter 15, the next sequence, when we first get this discussion that part of the question about these offsprings from the dust of the earth is that Abraham lacks a natural heir. Instead, it says Eliezer of Damascus is my heir. And that part of the covenant is that your own issue shall be your heir, and that you're going to have many, many descendants like the stars in the sky. And this is the first time we have an indication that that might be a question or a problem, that he has no heir. How can he have many descendants? This one also anticipates, it doesn't say Egypt, but it anticipates the enslavement in Egypt. And it makes a comment that to your descendants, I will give this land. Before there's been many, you're going to have many descendants. You are going to have this land, but now your descendants are also going to have this land. This moves us to the next iteration in Genesis 17. You see, these just keep on going. And here is the first time that Abram is now called Abraham, because of a slight derivation in his name, and that he'll be the ancestor of a multitude of nations. Again, very different from Genesis 1 to 11, where for the whole of it, there was not a multitude of nations until the introduction of Babel. Instead, all humans are classified together. Here, it's a multitude of nations for whom he will be the ancestor. And the covenant is going to be with Abram and descendants. See, later it says the descendants are going to be in the land, and there are going to be a lot of them, but there was no guarantee that the kind of covenant I have with you, Abram, is the kind of covenant I'm going to have with your descendants. And the way that that will be maintained is through the seal of circumcision. And so we have the dynamic of there is the same relationship God has with Abram, and Abraham is the same relationship God will have with Abram's descendants. And then finally, in Genesis 22, here with this scene of the sacrifice of Isaac, we have one of the final iterations of this covenant, and where it comes full circle, where this blessing, that it was those other nations, where the other nations, that if they bless you, they'll be blessed. If they curse you, they'll be cursed. Now is structured here, that for your offspring, other nations can receive blessing. So you see what we have is a dynamic space that moves forward and develops this covenant with Abram. And there's really many covenant structures. There's, of course, a lot of other things going on, and most people know about the whole narrative about Hagar and about the problem of children and many other things within this narrative. But I want to emphasize how different this is from the primeval history. Now we have one special, one chosen people, and it is very clearly a family structure. You and your descendants. And the descendants can be many, many generations down, but clearly this is one family. One family has been chosen by God, and that others will relate to God through this family, but seemingly not directly. How do other nations relate with God? Do they have some kind of direct relationship with God? We don't know. It doesn't say. What it tells us is that here is what many would suggest a new strategy. That God is no longer going to work directly with every last human being like it was in Genesis 1 to 11, and indeed there also every other animal, every other living thing. Now it's going to be not just with humans, but with this one family who is meant to be a blessing, and who is meant to be exemplars, and who is meant to relate with others as they can relate thereby with God. But It is a really different structure. We also have a special chosen land. It's the first time we have this idea that the land you'll inhabit is going to be somehow distinct and important. It's also the first time we have that ancestors really matter. And that, which makes sense for family and frankly for land. And so we see very new developments, but if you were to look at it, it's in the same book, and it might feel that there are parallels, and this is a natural development, but I'd just like to emphasize what is new, what has changed, and we will be continuing to think about that in our theology bits in the weeks to come. This is Theology Bits. I'm Pastor Ben.